Now you can hear me. Hello. Hopefully you can hear me. I just turned my mic on. Not sure how clear my face is. Maybe it's better if I'm not so clear. Huh. Well, welcome. I'm hoping we'll be seeing our guest shortly. Music's still probably a little too high for everybody. It's in my ear. So welcome to the show. My name is Ed Casas. I am a former archaeologist, which involves digging lots of holes in hot Florida sun. So I don't really recommend it. And the cultural artifacts are limited. You know, some of the best cultural artifacts from Florida actually come out of bogs and areas that were wet. It was able to preserve some really nice wooden pieces. So yeah, we got Bruce Fenton coming on today. He seems to have a good grip on some ancient going-ons. Seems to know a bit about the primates and humans. Let's see here. Let's see if he's got back to us. Let's see. This site can't ask for permission. What's this? He's having trouble with his camera, it seems. That's not good. Okay. So that's what's going on. You got a camera issue. You may have another app open. So hold on a second here. So it looks like our guest is a little behind here. That's okay. We can still entertain ourselves. So feel free to chat if you can see us. For example, here we go. Let's show gear. Hello, my friend. Thank you for joining us. So, you know, what's my purpose? My purpose has always been to be the sort of middleman between the hands-on medical scientific researchers and the public. And I was hoping with my archaeological background, I could add a little something to this. Instead, I've become very, very involved in studying the files, the medical files, which I think have revealed quite a few things, such as a third eye, a parietal pineal complex, Urostyle, which would be the name of that fused vertebrae the researchers noted. That's the result of absorbing a tail. In fact, if you ever notice, there are some, in a book at the very least, there are some depictions of the Tridactyls with tails. So let's see who else we got here. We got Sky coming in. How's it going, everybody? Good to see y'all. Feel free to check out our store. Not that I'm a grifter, but I do pay for this stuff, and I wonder why sometimes. I don't know. Maybe some of you guys have that same sort of issue. So I'll go ahead and share my window with you guys. All right. So, yeah, you can check me out at tridactyls.com. Got someone else coming in over here. Happy Sunday from Jared Rosenthal. Thank you. Happy Sunday to you too, Jared. And we did just sell a t-shirt recently. I forget which one we sold. But you can see we've got some limited things up there. It's not a lot. Could probably add some more. We have Kia, which is we have a little thematic, sort of fun cartoon Tridactyls. So that's a fun shirt. This one's inspired by cobras. Here's a sort of a cartoony kind of version of what we call the Ka, the forgotten god. One of the cool things we've discovered that we did not expect to find while investigating our Tridactyl friends, I have to say. So let's go ahead and stop that. All right, who else we got coming in? Another happy Sunday. So Bruce might be having some technical difficulties here. Let's see. We haven't seen him yet, unfortunately. And I wish I could tell you more about his research, but I kind of purposely left it blank so I could be surprised with you. Yeah, I think I had too many things up running at once. I had the DICOM files, the cameras running. So who knows? And I just got frustrated trying to even fight it. So yeah, that was a very short-lived broadcast. So I feel like I should catch up. So I was just explaining sort of my role here, and hopefully, again, as a former archaeologist, former paleotech, former museum employee, I was hoping I could lend some credibility to some of this, because I know there's just a sea of confusion and a lot of misinformation out there. In fact, I was hoping Bruce was going to talk a little bit about that today too, his experiences, and maybe you could tell me, Sky, you're in this world. Maybe other people. Let me ask you, have you ever shared one of your theories with someone and you feel like you were ghosted or ignored? Let me know in the comments, or feel free to, some of you guys, if anyone wants to come on and say hello, you could do that as well. So I don't have a lot of updates for you. Again, I just wanted to go over what I was supposed to go over last week. So what is that? A lot of people are saying they don't know what the Tridactyls are. Well, I like to think we do. So for fun, let's go ahead and take a look at our latest meme, although it was probably up on the screen, even though you couldn't hear me, right? But I think it's one of my favorite memes so far. I call them memes. They're info memes, right? They're really little bite-sized bits of information that I throw up on the internet there. And we'll just share this screen with you here. So yeah, let's just go over some of these things. I got some weird Christian Zionism going on. We don't need to see that. Biological assertions on the Tridactyls from the constant companion theory. So those of you that know me, I chose constant companion because I believe the symbolic language of humanity is inspired by the physical structure of these beings. That is why in the Semitic tongue we have the shin, which is the three-pronged letter. And in Chinese, it's shan, also related to three mountains. So here we go. So Gears answering my question. Thank you, Gears. I'm considered a conspiracy theorist within my circle of friends, but for some reason they're always listening to my off-the-wall ideas. All right. Well, that's good at least. So some of these assertions are mine. I feel like there is no other answer. These are amphibian-grade organisms, and your cursory investigation into this would be, well, the three fingers, the three toes. Go check out some of those three-toed frogs or three-fingered salamanders, or are they newts? I think they're salamanders. So your tridactylism is your first clue. Now, the researchers also mentioned that fused lower vertebra. So we're going to call that a urostyle, which is a frog feature. Cutaneous respiration. There's no evidence of lungs. So that's really the key. That's the big one. I probably should have moved that up on the line there. If they're breathing cutaneously, guys. If there's no lungs, if that's true. Okay, well, what is that telling us? Now, personally, I have what I believe discovered a parietal third eye pineal complex. I knew what it was when I saw it. Let's hope for further confirmation. Although I say that, but I sent the screenshots over to the definitive singular expert in a dual photoreceptor pineal complex. Likely sequential hermaphroditism. Admittedly, much of that hypothesis is from modern mythology. Male beings in our humanity's cosmology becoming female or vice versa, which I understand some species can do both. Can you imagine becoming female and then male, and then I don't know if they go back again after that? Seems like it would wear you out. So why else sequential hermaphroditism? It's funny. Well, first of all, there's only one with exterior genitals, right? That could be also a clue. But Maria came back as both male and female in different parts of her body. Now, I guess that could be an incorrect read. Could be other things that we will not mention. We'll say it could be just incorrect read. So some of this is also based on just amphibians. This is what I'm talking about. Amphibians can do this, so I wouldn't be surprised. It's a little bit of a hypothesis and not a huge amount of evidence. Parthenogenic reproduction, that kind of goes hand in hand with this. Again, until further evidence, this may be just what's happening. We do see what looks like the eggs are already hatching. So they were dried in a state of hatching, or perhaps they tried to escape during this time. Asynchronous development, meaning the eggs are developing at different speeds. There are different signs. Hey, I think we've got someone in our waiting room. So we'll just finish up this this little card here, this info meme. Multi-embryonic, so it looks like there are several tridactyl specimens within one egg, which means they could practice embryophagy. Embryophagy. I mean, that would just be interesting. So if there's multi-embryonic, so that means perhaps the strongest of the fittest survives this egg. Where the scientists are finding evidence of saline, saltwater minerals. And this, again, going along with the cultural assertions, our cultural hypothesis, is probably related to some saltwater lakes in the Himalayas. That's a different story. Forelimb first development, and this, again, we're seeing this in the archaeological record. And that would be like an axolotl, which is, of course, has some religious value to it, those salamanders. And telescoping generations means, did I see eggs within the embryos? Are they, in fact, born pregnant? Is that the origins of our Russian doll? All right, ladies and gentlemen, let's see here. What is this here? We've got someone commenting. I remember seeing a slit. Yeah, that would be the cloaca. Exactly. All right, we're going to stop our share. And we are going to invite our guest. How exciting. Let's see how we do this. Wow, there we go. I think I might move you over to my side there. How awesome. Can you hear me, sir? Mr. Bruce, Mr. Fenton?
I can, yes. Can you hear me?
Yes. Thank you so much for coming.
Great. No, a pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
And I see you have the that nice medieval Renaissance painting of the tapestry of a unicorn. What is the name of
that? I know it's from a set. I can't remember the name of the set. It's a set of, I think it's 4 different unicorn pictures, and this is one of the tapestries.
Very good. How interesting. Now, is there any particular reason you have that, or just because it's a fine piece of art?
But yeah, partly because it's a fine piece of art, partly because I saw someone selling that fine piece of art for an incredibly low price and grabbed it as quick as I could, knowing it was worth a lot more than they were selling it for.
Very nice. Very nice. Okay, so tell us a little bit about yourself. I'm going to go ahead and give you the full shot here, the full camera view.
Yeah, so for anyone who doesn't know about my research, I'm involved with, I'm the director of a non-profit called the Alien Technosignatures Research Group in the UK, and we are focused on quite an obscure project, but it's essentially search for extraterrestrial intelligence, but like post-detection, so that we have identified some what we consider to be very likely alien technosignatures in the prehistoric kind of records, both in geological and genomic records. So we are basically deep diving some quite specific potential signatures, and myself mainly, but with some collaboration from a couple of friendly scientists, geologists, and biologists, and a couple of other people. So I won't give the whole thing, but yes, I'm also written a couple of books and I've appeared on a couple of TV shows in the past, History Channel and Science Channel. So people may well recognize me from there, and of course from Twitter, discussing aliens and those kind of topics regularly on there.
And so what are the titles to your books so our audience can...
Yeah, the previous one, so 2017 published the Forgotten Exodus, the Into Africa theory of human evolution. So that's me basically finding flaws in the current consensus for human origins and the early migrations from both Africa, Asia, and to some degree Australia. Doesn't really deal with America, but up until the populating of America, basically. So up to around 20. Well, to say that it crosses that time, but I just don't really tackle America. I think that's fair to say. So the rest of that story, going back millions of years, up until about 13,000 years ago. So yeah, it essentially rewrites a number of stories, including the Denisovan story. So I was actually, I think, the first person to posit the idea that Australasia was the home of the Denisovans, essentially their main homeland. Obviously, there were Denisovans elsewhere, but it seems to be in their main homeland, as well as making some arguments for a repopulating of Asia from Oceania around 55,000 years ago. So some controversial ideas, but some of these have become actually far less controversial since 2017. And then in 2020, published Exogenesis Hybrid Humans. And that had some links to it because, again, it's dealing with our origins, but bringing in an argument for an intervention event in our evolutionary story 788,000 years ago. Some of the evidence being the same, some of the genetic data on early hominins and stuff. So I had some advantages in terms of knowing a lot of the literature when I wrote that book, which helped a lot because I kind of detected what seemed to be indications of manipulation. So, it was quite handy that I already knew the hominin literature. So the two books are kind of different, but have that related theme that they are about our origins and the transition from, archaic hominins to the first ancestral Homo sapiens, which I make the case for being an event around 788,000 years ago. So I'll go a little bit into that in a bit, but essentially, there's two different camps. As you know, there's a camp that would say Homo sapiens arises sort of 200,000 to 300,000 years ago, and that's based on morphological arguments and to certain levels of genetics, but not very much so. But if you take more of a genomic kind of standpoint, really the biggest difference that occurs in our story is closer to 800,000 years ago, and that's when we have the divergence of ancestral Homo sapiens, Denisovans, and Neanderthals away from Homo erectus. And after that, all of these large-brained humans are able to interbreed, and so are functionally a single species. But for some quite sensible reasons, there's splitting that's done because it's easier to talk about these populations as distinct species. So Neanderthals, Denisovans, Sapiens, because they do have quite clear morphological differences, but at the fundamental kind of genomic level, they're not that different, and they do have children together. So, that's probably a little bit aside. So I'll get back to you. But just for people that wonder how I make that case, because I know that most people would say Homo sapiens, 200,000 years, maybe 300,000 years old. But yeah, that it's really to do with a preference of how you talk about these early hominins rather than a kind of some sort of absolute. Because unless they couldn't reproduce together, because they were definitively genetically isolated, but clearly they weren't.
Yeah, there's a couple reasons why I wanted to have you on. I feel like there is some overlap, and I'm hoping that maybe either maybe you can even redirect my research, or there's some sort of common ground even further. Mm-hmm. So I'm definitely interested in a lot of this. The other thing was I wanted you to talk about is that your recent post, alluding to something about shouting into the void. And I know it's a little, not really the topic of what we're here for, but could you discuss that just a little? What your sentiments were on that?
Sure. Yeah. So this is, I think anyone who spends considerable time arguing for a change, paradigm change, something that really goes against the main consensus within a field of science, will at times certainly be familiar with the feeling of that, you're sort of shouting to the void when you're communicating your arguments, because you have a lot of weight against you. You have, I don't want to sound like, there's always this sort of the lone hard done by crank, which is kind of, an archetype in, ancient mysteries topics and aliens and all of these areas. But there's actually an issue if you are in the much smaller camp, and there's a much larger camp that has the consensus and has let's say, the media, the majority of universities are in agreement with them. That when you go against that, I think the audience, is obviously front loaded with the assumption that you must be wrong, because otherwise, wouldn't all of these other people be agreeing with you, or wouldn't they even be excited to hear you? So, and I can totally understand that. So the appearance to people can be that, well, you must be wrong, so why should we take it seriously? And without taking the evidence seriously and looking at it, they can't really come to an informed choice. So there's obviously a lot of knee-jerk dismissal, and of course, you're familiar with that, for looking at Tridactyls, and I think anyone who is looking at evidence for a hypothesis that is, an outsider hypothesis, is controversial and has a quite aggressive pushback from the main speakers in the existing narrative, will have times where I think they can empathize with the idea that, you're almost screaming into the void at times, and then, other times you can get some traction. But yeah, I think it does. There's definitely ups and downs, and it's an uphill battle. You've got a lot of resources pitted against your position, and most of us, loose networks of independent scholars, maybe helping each other, but certainly not without the huge funding or the access to media that the consensus academic kind of framework has, as you know. So yeah, that would be my sense. At times, it definitely is a thing of screaming into the void.
Yeah, that's definitely how I feel. It's just funny too. It's just that, before the Tridactyls, I was a huge skeptic on anything to do with the Bible, Anunnaki, reptilians. Any of these things were just absolutely ridiculous to me, and I think that's partially what we're taught in just general schooling, but in academia. And as a former archaeologist, I feel like definitely we're always taught to stray away from any of these sort of fringe ideas, So yeah, I appreciated that post, and it's been very strange sometimes, and also just sort of willful ignorance, and I like what you just said actually about people are sort of trained to sort of dismiss this sort of thing. And the conspiracy theorist to me is like, right. Oh, well, is it trained or bred? So maybe we're not supposed to, question. So I like your numbers for obviously the Erectus change, and just to add a little bit, I don't want to detract from anything you're saying, because I might call that a battle of woo when we have like two different theories conflicting with one another. But I find the Erectus situation interesting, and the islands of Indonesia. I'm noting that, of course, some serious agriculture is coming from that region from tens of thousands of years ago. The pig, domestication of the pig, and Homo erectus. And it makes me wonder sometimes if this is some sort of, if the three sisters of Native American agriculture, it's the corn, it's the bean, and the squash all being planted together. And sometimes I wonder if erectus and pigs and other things are some sort of circular crop that works together, and that utilizing these islands, anyone that was doing any sort of manipulation of primate DNA would be able to control the non-swimming primates and protect resources from primates as well, as part of my thing. So yeah, so can you fill me in on, I guess, that moment in time that I noticed someone else was asking about that also. We could probably even pull up the old comment again. That would be fun.
Yeah, I mean,
there's the old comment. Intervention 788,000 years ago is interesting. So what can you say about that?
Yeah, I'll precede that a little bit for people that aren't too familiar. I mean, with the basic story of Homo erectus. So Homo erectus is In my opinion, but certainly not my opinion alone, the first of the Homo genus that is, let's say, entirely human-like. Previous to that, you have what I would say is more ape-like hominins. That these were still kind of brachiators. They lived in nests. They were not fully ground-based hominins. So Homo erectus is the first entirely ground-based. It's not in nests. It behaves recognizably like human. As I sort of make the joke, if one of these early kind of humans was to get on the bus, instead of you get off. But if you saw it in the zoo, you would ask, what's that guy doing in the cage? They're sort of different enough to be that you could recognize that they're different, but they're so similar that you can see that they're certainly not a chimp or a gorilla. They are a kind of human. So, but 2 million years ago, you get the first signs of Homo erectus appearing both in southern Africa and also now, also in parts of Western Eurasia, Georgian Republic, and also I think it's down in Romania. They found some traces of a presence there 2 million years ago. So we don't know exactly where Homo erectus appears, which is kind of, again, it's an interesting mystery that's kind of recently arisen, is the fact that Homo erectus seems to be present both in Africa and outside of Africa at approximately the same time 2 million years ago. Now, what we do know is, in fact, actually, there's quite a while it's been sort of suggested that there's a slight split. You have Homo ergaster, which is basically African erectus, and then kind of Homo erectus outside of Africa, it's kind of Asian erectus. So there's a slight difference between the two groups. But these Asian erectus, they managed to get all the way down to Southeast Asia and to island Southeast Asia by just over 1 million years ago. So we know that they have managed to cross Wallace's line, which was considered as a fairly impenetrable barrier to large mammals until we found the evidence that they crossed it. And so they arrive on Flores about 1 million years ago. And you might have seen as well that in the last few weeks.
So hold on. I'm going to stop you there. So
sure.
this is. You're suggesting that erectus is originating from Australia and heading?
No. So I'm saying it's just unknown whether it appears first in Africa
so when you
or
said
Europe.
it crossed the Wallace line going south.
Yeah. So it's crossing from Asia. Sorry. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I don't know why I thought otherwise. Okay.
Yeah,
okay.
No, that's fine.
And about what time was that? So I can
Right, so until very recently, 4 million years ago, but I don't know if you caught the discovery of tools on Sulawesi in the last couple of weeks. So they think that it may be that erectus was on Sulawesi up to 1.5 million years ago. So that's quite incredible, because that would mean that they essentially had moved all the way down from the borderlands of Africa to Sulawesi within 500,000 years, which is really quite a rapid spread, and to have crossed Wallace line, deep water channels. So they need to have used some kind of watercraft, and that's a massive breakthrough, because again, this is a fairly small-brained hominin, and we've got to give it some credit here, because there's no way you can get a viable population swimming across these extreme currents. So they have to have used some kind of watercraft, and so they then managed to get to Flores, Sulawesi, and within a few 100,000 years, they reach another one of the islands as well. I'm trying to figure it. They're also up in the Philippines. You've got traces again within a few 100,000 years of that. So we know that they are now spreading between these islands, right? The really interesting thing here as well for people that again maybe don't follow the subject too much is that we know that around about it's now becoming clear that around about 1 million years ago there is a population crash. It's actually sort of 930,000 years ago, so this is a year ago. So they have calculated, they think that there was a 99% drop in the human population, a loss of 99% of the breeding pairs, down to 1,000 odd people. Now that's extraordinary, because although there was a cold climate at the time, difficult times, but there's nothing that should cause a 99% drop. Now, as you'll know, one of the ways that you end up with such a drop like that, one is a cataclysm, the other one is a bottleneck. And the thing about this is the timing of hominins reaching these islands and crossing Wallace's line is fantastically close to when we see this drop. So for me, I'm suggesting that this is a bottleneck, that we're seeing these Homo erectus cross Wallace's line become reproductively isolated on these islands. And no doubt within a few tens of thousands of years, they should have reached Australia. So Australia was, well, you can see between the islands, and it's quite clear they were doing this. They were crossing between islands that they could see. And at many periods in the past, you could see across to a chain of islands just north of the coast of Australia, from which you could then see Australia. So again, if you're spreading between these islands on watercraft, you should come upon the enormous continent to your south. So there's a big question mark as being, well, if they've done all the hard work of crossing Wallace's line, why aren't they in Australia? And, you know, so I make the argument that it's almost certain that they were, and that the problem, what we're seeing now, is Australia with a 130-meter sea level rise. So all of this coastal region is gone. All of these additional shelves, the islands, they're all under deep water. So anywhere that was first settled is gone. So we have this problem that without oceanic, you know, archaeology happening, it's very hard to establish this. But between the genetic data and knowing that these hominins are there at the right moment, I'm suggesting that we do have Homo erectus in Australia, and that also that there's a population that goes on to Papua and becomes the ancestors of the Denisovans, who we know the Denisovans were concentrated in Papua because modern Papuans have about 5 to 8% of their DNA is Denisovan. There's nowhere else in the world with those levels of Denisovan DNA, right?
Okay.
But it's not just one type of Denisovan. They have 3 distinct populations of Denisovans represented in their DNA. No, again, nowhere else in the world like that. We don't see that in East Asian people, right? So it's very telling. So Denisovans must have been living on Papua. So how did they get there? And when did they get there? So moving a little bit aside from that, because I know we're talking about the alien side, I just saying that we have to first establish, in my work, I studied first that there is a population in that region, because I'm making an argument that this intervention happens in that region. And so first there has to be someone there to intervene with. And again, so that's a contentious issue, because you can't establish from fossils that the people are there. But the inference is we know they're moving between these islands, and we know there's a bottleneck, right? So then where this goes into, kind of dovetails into alien technosignatures. Again, I just want to give people a bit of a brief base of the hominins we're dealing with. So again, they are somewhat intelligent, you know, they've got boats and, you know, interesting tools, but they're not completely like us. There's significant brain changes that are going to occur. And we know from the fossil record, there is a inexplicable sudden expansion of the brain size from around 800,000 years ago. And previous to that, you see cranial capacity has increased in line with body size. So, you know, if anyone looks at a chart, they'll see that, you know, it's a fairly gentle incline up until around 800,000 years ago, and then there's a sudden explosion. This is really kind of a key area, you know, that we knew before genetics. You know, so we knew about this before the genetic data, that there's something happens at that time. Now, kind of prefacing my work. So where this goes into alien technosignatures, where it kind of leaves my previous book, which is The Forgotten Exodus, which tackles kind of all of that, is that whilst I was doing my research, I was connected with a writer in Australia called Valerie Barrow, who had written a book back in 2003, which she tells this story of having come into contact with an object called a chiringa, which is an Aboriginal sacred artifact. And she tells this story basically that, you know, it's given to her temporarily to look after by a lady who's trying to get this thing back to the indigenous keepers, the traditional keepers of this artifact. Very sacred artifact, should never really be with kind of Western people or outside of Aboriginal culture. But it had ended up being found years ago in a cave by a cameleer. And I don't know if you know any Australian history, but the cameleers were Afghan and Pakistani people that were brought to Australia with their camels, and they plied wares across the Central Red Desert in a way that nobody else really could, and were invaluable to the kind of the foundational stage in Australia, right? So one of these cameleers apparently found this chiringa in a cave back in, so it'd be the 1870s, that kind of time, from my understanding. And this chiringa had been passed down in their family. Now, they wanted it to go back to the indigenous people. So they'd gone through a contact, a lady called Helen Boyd, who It's actually an interesting character in her own right. She was a writer for a number of Australian television shows, including Neighbours and Country Doctors and a few other things, also a filmmaker. But she had a lot of inroads with Aboriginal people. And so she agreed she would try and get this artifact back to the people, most likely the Arenti people near Uluru in the Red Desert. She got very unwell. She wanted someone to look after this thing temporarily. Valerie was suggested to her by mutual friends, and also partly because Valerie lived in a house called Al Chiringa, and so she saw that as a bit of a coincidence, because this is a Chiringa from the Al Chiringa. The Al Chiringa is the dream time. That's the Arente term for dream time. And so she thought, this is, seems like someone I should ask. They had a conversation. Valerie agrees to look after it whilst Helen is in hospital for medical treatment. And it's while she has this artifact in her house, she claims to start having these voice-to-skull contact events with an intelligence associated with this artifact. Now, of course, that sounds very sci-fi or very new age or very crazy, however you want to put it. But the thing is, she gets an entire narrative, eventually over a period of time, she gets this entire narrative of a prehistoric visitation, a claim from this artifact or this voice that there has been a visitation by an intelligence from distant galaxy that has, what's a distant star system, I should say, not distant galaxy, that has come here, and that there'd been a series of events involving a large ship that had been here, was destroyed by another group that was present already on this planet. Pieces of this ship rained down across the planet. Silicon AI megastructure, basically, is described as. And that there is then a few survivors. These few survivors become involved with modifying the hominins that they find present in Australia, where they come down. And that then there is the other event that they highlight, which is important to my work, is they say that 5 years later there is a follow-up mission by this same group, and they basically enforce this, what was an original agreement, that the planet was meant to be handed over, and that they say there is a bombardment. They redirect asteroids and they bombard areas of the planet where this other group are positioned, essentially in underground bases, and they utilize these. And they kind of say that these things are, that they can potentially split a planet. They say that your nukes are like pea shooters, compared to what we can do. We can just split a planet open if we want to with these bombardments. Insane, right? So it sounds completely far out. It's like a science fiction, a good science fiction movie, though, because there's a lot, aspects I'd like to see as a film. But when I first heard of this, I thought, well, if it's true, these events are on such a scale that they should leave traces, and there should be some way for me to check this and see if there's anything to this, because it was such a complex narrative, so much detail. I felt kind of compelled to, I felt compelled to it. It's very, very grabbed me. It very grabbed me. But I wanted to make sure that there was something to it before taking it on myself or discussing it publicly. Otherwise it's just someone else's book and great story. But obviously I had my own projects to deal with, with the Out of Africa stuff. But the more I looked into it, the more I realized it did seem that there was something to it. And I just did a very quick whistle stop and then let you comment. Is that the first thing I found was that so they'd said in the timescale was towards, there were 2 dates I saw came up in her work, that towards 900,000, and then at one point she mentions that maybe towards 700,000. It was a little bit vague, so I'll look into 700 to 900. Is there anything like that? Well, that's a good broad 200,000 year scale, and what I found is that it's 790,000 years ago approximately, that we have this shower of molten silica glass, like a metal silica kind of glass, that rains down across a 12,000 kilometer long field from China down to Antarctica. So I thought, well, she's claiming that she was told there's this rain of molten debris from this kind of silica crystalline AI megastructure, and I'm finding that there's this mysterious rain of silica glass that pours from the skies in approximately the right time. So, well, that's quite uncanny. I'd never heard of this, what's called the Australasian tectite stream field. So I'd never heard of that at the time. Now I thought, well, okay, that could be coincidence. Could be just that, stroke of luck that there's something like that. But with the other 2 points, there was this, within a few years, supposedly an asteroid bombardment. Well, that is something that would absolutely leave scars. We should be able to find that. Now, if you were to find that and it times with the other event, of course, that's kind of uncanny. And that's exactly what happened. It turns out that in 2016, a team of geologists from a German university identified evidence of a multi-directional asteroid bombardment. And the dating on that is at 770 to 790 years ago. And they said what they actually think is it's contemporaneous with the Australasian tektite Struenfield fall. And so they found that there is evidence of impacts in Central America, Laos, potentially Antarctica, potentially Canada, with some traces, and also Tasmania. Now, it's super weird to have more than one asteroid hit the planet at the same time. Like, most people are probably familiar with the idea that there's a large impact every 10,000 and a larger one every 100,000 and so on. These things are quite distributed. So to get 4 or 5 distinct asteroids slamming into the planet at the same time from different sides is unheard of after the kind of the late heavy bombardment, the formative period of our planet. So again, this is an extraordinary event. So now you've got a fall of molten glass stretching from China to Antarctica and a multi-directional asteroid bombardment at the same time. And I've got this account here where it's claiming, you know, this megastructure melts and falls in the sky, and that there's a follow-up event with a multi-directional bombardment. So when you get 2 for 2 for events on those scale, and events that, certainly in the case of the asteroid bombardment, were not known when she was writing this back in 2003, it hadn't been discovered, she can't be accused of cherry picking, you know, she doesn't know exists. And yet here they are aligning. Now the third one, of course, was the genetic intervention, and that's really the one that's the most kind of, well, impactful if true. You know, even if we say aliens came here and the other things, you know, if we allow for that, it's much more impactful to say, and then they did something to our ancestors. So I had some advantages to that area, having already, you know, explored the literature, as I said earlier. So I was aware that there is several different lines of evidence that suggest the split from Homo erectus occurs approximately 750 to 800,000 years ago, that approximately in that region, that there's the initial divergence at the genomic level, right? And that has, in fact, over the years, is actually strengthened to now it's pretty much agreed that that is when this occurs. So we get the split that then leads to the ancestors of Denisovans and Neanderthals, who will eventually split from each other, but also the ancestors of Homo sapiens. We kind of, you know, all begin to diverge at this point, and then later there's further splits. But the thing is, it's not just that they kind of just naturally diverge. There's some very strange signatures in the genome associated with this divergence. I'll do a whistle stop for you, because they can get a bit technical for listeners, and I don't want to necessarily make people go through all of it, because they can check some of this. But the main lines were what's called human accelerated regions, human conserved deletions, and a three-dimensional genome refolding event. So I'll do those very quickly. I want to precede again just quickly as well, that if you were to look for evidence of a message encoded in DNA, it's called genomic SETI, which is a field of SETI research which isn't much referred to, but the idea that, you know, advanced aliens could communicate with us by deliberately engineering an organism, leaving a message in the genome, or of course could just modify an organism and leave some signature that they did this. That if you're going to look for that, you wouldn't necessarily look in genes. That's because genes change. They change fairly rapidly on this kind of, you know, genomic and geological scale. So where you would really want to look is in highly conserved non-coding regions of the genome. So that there are some areas that are incredibly stable, where, you know, you might have sequences of code that are unchanged between all the mammals, for example, that, you know, have been the same for tens or hundreds of millions of years. If you see incredible changes there, then that is telling that you may be looking at some kind of signature from intelligence, right? And it turns out that that's exactly what we have found, right? So in the non-coding DNA, they have found now several hundred what seem to be modified regions. They're called human accelerated regions. And these are areas that the code has evolved incredibly fast, beyond any expectations, and when contrasted with other mammals, are uniquely different in humans, okay? They also found what's called human conserved deletions. So these are segments of, again, highly conserved DNA that seem to be removed. And again, this is strange, because these areas must be doing something incredibly important in all the mammals, because they're there in all the other mammals, and yet they are gone in us. And they think that these have allowed areas of the genome to interact that have helped brain function change, right? The same as most of these HARs have to do with brain function. And then the third one, which is really, really telling, this three-dimensional genome refolding event. They found that the entire structure of the genome kind of reconfigures, and it does so in a way that, again, allows sections of code to interact in novel ways that have helped with our brain development. And the thing in particular about that last one is, and they say that this happens in a single generation, that this is either in a kind of a single egg, sperm, fetus, or a very small group of people. But this is an overnight event. This is not an accruing of errors, which is the fundamental principles of natural evolution, mutations over time and selection. No, this is being posited as something that happened in a single generation. So this is really quite astonishing, particularly anyone who follows evolutionary biology knows that's not what we really mean when we talk about evolutionary processes. This is something quite that they didn't expect to see at all. So three areas of things, in fact, they didn't expect to see. Highly conserved DNA changing multiple times over a fairly short period. Large sections are disappearing that should be doing something really important. And then this one-off event that reconfigures the genome. So when you're being told that there was an intervention, and then you find the exact kind of signatures that genomic SETI is meant to focus on, unexpected changes in highly conserved DNA, and you find them in spades, and that they're nearly all to do with our unique brain, then there's something strange going on there that needs much closer, attention. So that's kind of what really drew me in and made me go public with my support for this, is just the confluence of those three major areas, and then the dating on them being so incredibly close.
So are you able to trace these genetic supposed interventions to this same time period, and how?
So some of these have been traced to that period. So for example, the three-dimensional refolding event, when they put this article out, they said about 1 million years ago, something changes the genome. So I reached out to them. So I thought, well, about 1 million years ago, it's a bit vague, and it's obviously earlier than the time I'm talking about, not crazily earlier, but early enough, a couple 100,000 years out. So I wanted to know, did they really mean 1 million years ago? And so they responded and said, well, no, actually, what we're saying is that it appears that this occurs just before the split from the Denisovans, Neanderthals, and us splitting from Erectus. So again, in that same time where this is happening. So it's approximately right in there. The other thing that's happened again, on this topic very recently, is there's also been established now that the chromosome 2 end-to-end fusion happens approximately at this time as well, about 800,000 years ago. And we know that has been associated with the idea of reproductive isolation of our lineage from Homo erectus. So this is been posited at the same time. With the HARs, some of them are associated with those inexplicable changes we see in the fossil record. So knowing that, bear in mind again, so we knew already something had happened to us, but we didn't have the genetic data. So we already knew that there was something that had occurred. And of course, when you see the brain size change and this reconfiguration of the brain, there's a genomic component, right? And so we know that there is a genomic change at around 800,000 years ago. So we knew that already. But what we know now is what those changes were. So you can't date all of these to then. To be quite clear that there's always an uncertainty with the dating of kind of genetic changes. Like no one's going to say it's to the day. Do you know what I mean? So or even to the century or whatever. There's always a bit of a vague area here. But what they can say is that these are the changes associated with those changes we see in the fossil record that are dated to approximately 800,000 years, and that these also are occurring when we know that the chromosome 2 fusion has occurred, when this reconfiguring occurs. So they're like we say, in the ballpark, that they all appear to be approximately when we see this split, but it's very hard to pin down absolute dates on these kind of genetic changes at that distance in time. So for sure, there's certainly some uncertainty there on some of them. Like there's several hundred HARs. I would imagine, but I know some of them are not from then, right? That there are some that seem to occur more recently, for example, and that we have differences between Neanderthals and Denisovans that are in some of these areas. So there does seem to be some reconfiguring later on in relation to the split from, Neanderthals, Denisovans, and us. So we don't all go on and stay exactly the same. And it seems in some cases, some of these HRs may be associated with that. So the bulk of the major changes are in all three groups, but there are some that are distinct later. So it looks like we have a period where the vast majority of the anomalies are centered upon, and some uncertainty about a few of them. Yeah.
So I guess a sort of follow-up question seems to be, what evidence do you have in the human genome, DNA background, that there is something off-planet about us?
Yeah, I mean, the reality is that with genomic data, you can't say absolutely that aliens did it. I mean, I'd put that quite squarely, because the fact is you can always make the case that there is an unknown evolutionary mechanism that we will one day discover, right? And that would explain it. So although what we're seeing is in line with the suggestion that if we were going to look for evidence of genetic engineering, that we'd look in these non-coding regions, and that what we're seeing, the chances of them happening by natural means. And again, I'm going to actually sort of go back to the main theorist on this, the lady actually discovered it. So she was a biostatistician, right? And so she creates the software that kind of crunches the numbers on the likelihood of these things happening. And so the first one they looked at, called HAR1, they came to the conclusion it had essentially, so this is their words, essentially a 0% chance of occurring by any known evolutionary means. So they really are not seeing a way where this should be there by any way we understand currently. And give some context. So they were comparing this short segment of code between chickens, chimpanzees, and humans. And so it's a 118 DNA letter long segment of code. So it's very short, much shorter than a gene, a short segment of code. And so they cross-reference it. And what they found is that between the chicken and the chimpanzee, there were 2 letters had changed in 300 million years of separate evolution, right? So extremely stable, 1 mutation successful for every 150 million years of evolution, right? So incredibly stable code. And then when they contrasted between the chimps and humans, with 7 million years between us, they found that 18 letters had changed. So we're not talking about like, a trivial level of acceleration. We're talking about an astonishing level of acceleration, which was totally counter to the expectations. And so they've now gone and found several hundred of these. And the clustering is also interesting, because the majority seem to be influencing brain development in the fetal stages, and that also are the key and also the key differences between us and the other primates. They're saying that these HRs seem to be what make us different to the other primates. So when you think about that, what people say, why are we so different to other primates? Well, it turns out it's anomalous segments of code that nobody expected to be there, and that most of them cluster in brain changes in fetuses. So you're like, well, that doesn't sound random to me. And again, right? You know what I mean? If this was all across the board, and it was about how your kidneys work and your legs grow, but when you start to get towards like half or more to do with fetal brain development and the things that make us different to all the other primates, then you really are getting towards the expectations of what you'd see if you were looking at evidence of someone manipulating our lineage to change our brain and to take a more primate-like hominin and turn it into us. Because these that kind of changes that we're seeing. And the fact that they are fundamentally anomalous, unexpected and unexplained. And that then when you add on the chromosome 2 fusion being at the same time, which again, on its own, we might say, fusions can happen. There's some oddities about that chromosome fusion, but that it's not on its own. So then if you say then there's also this chromosome fusion, which would have helped make us reproductively isolated to the other hominins, right? So again, if you wanted to cut us off from going back, right, say interbreeding again with Homo erectus and becoming more of a downgraded species, a good way to do that is to change us so that we are almost incompatible with those Homo erectus, right? That there's a strong reproductive barrier from them. So when we do encounter them again, most of those pregnancies will fail, right? And so we have that happens at the same time. And then so you start saying, well, hang on, then you've got deletions, these unexpected deletions that, again, most of the ones they're looking at that I've seen them talk about are to do with the brain. And so he's saying we would have thought these would cause problems. The expectation is they would cause problems because these are essential areas of code in mammals, and yet they vanish in us. And instead of causing problems, they seem to enhance brain function. What? So these super important bits of code, the areas that have disappeared, give us a benefit to our brain. So, which again, it's like the brain seems to be the HRs, the brain from the H condyles, the reproductive isolation of the chromosome 2. Start to look at these things and think, although you can't say absolutely, that if you've been told, again, let's do it. So you've received information from what appears to be an alien probe. Alien probe tells you said story. It says, yes, there was a visitation. We manipulated the hominin lineage. You would find evidence in this lineage of manipulation. This is roughly when it happened, blah, blah, blah. And you go and look, and you find approximately the date that they're talking about. There are inexplicable changes across the board in the chromosomes, some of the genes, certainly in these fundamental kind of, highly conserved regions. And you see in the fossil record, the brain acceleration inexplicably occurring at the same time. So you're looking at, again, several levels of distinct physical data that if you hadn't had that message, from a probe or whatever, you'd still look at and say, what the hell is going on here? This is super strange. But then when you say, well, you've been told to look for this by an intelligence and it's there. So this is really the problem I had. It's not that I went looking where someone else would say, you're just doing the kind of God of the gaps, alien of the gaps, or, the creationists are looking to prove God made humans, so they look for certain anomalies. That it's not that. It's quite the opposite. You've been told a very specific time. So you've got it has to be in a very specific window, because we can't say, well, this debris is 900,000 years old. This impact is 850. These genetic changes are 700, and I cobble them together and say, well, it's close enough. That would be definitely not a genuine way of doing it, right? Because you're sort of just trying to make it all fit.
Right.
But what we have is really a confluence of individually anomalous events at the same time, and that match what's coming from the claims of this encounter, with someone saying that they've been told this, and now it's there. So for me, that was what I would put as, it's so strong that I can't ignore that. And I very quickly give someone an example, and I'll let you have a comment. I'll just say that the example I've used with a couple of other people is if I was to go online and tell someone, look, I've seen a ghost in my bedroom, and this ghost has told me it buried a pot of gold under a tree in your garden. Well, first of all, you'd think, well, that's crazy. Bruce has gone nuts, But then if you went out and you dug in your garden at that tree and you found a pot of gold, you're going to come back to me with a very different perspective on my ghost encounter, right?
That's
because
true.
No matter how strange something is, if you can go and find evidence that the information communicated was accurate, you might not believe there was a ghost, but you're going to believe that I've got information coming from somewhere, because you're validating the information. And that's my perspective. So it doesn't really matter if it comes from ghosts, spirits, God. But if the information leads you to objective evidence that validates what you're being told, then we have to take it seriously, no matter how strange it is.
Mm-hmm. And when I was asking, it wasn't that I was concerned about the manipulation, because there definitely seems to be evidence of manipulation. It was more so whether these are homegrown operators that are engaged in this, or from somewhere else. Because I had two data points come together when looking at 65% unknown based on what's in the record of living things. That matched up with a series of morphological traits that both pointed to a 400 million year old, 500 million year old point of origin. So, which is why I suggest, is there any actual evidence of being off planet, or could we be dealing with some homegrown species?
I don't think that we can, although the message is claiming that they've come from somewhere else. I think the reality is humans are in no position to be able to discern whether something is a ancient alien, civilization that lived here, alien to us, but a prehistoric civilization that was from our solar system, if not our planet, versus one that came from somewhere else. I don't see that we have any way right now to discern that. And the same as when people say, oh, we might be dealing with time travelers or interdimensional. We have no way to discern those origins. I think the only thing we can do is say, well, we know that life existed in our solar system. So in many ways, your first, assumption should be an advanced intelligence is from our solar system. That would be the least additional entities added. Second to that is, well, there's reasons to think that life can cross between different areas, and panspermia is probably accurate. We're finding all the building blocks and in space. We also know that interstellar objects are crossing between different solar systems. We've had 3 of them now, so we know that life can move between systems. So the second most reasonable is aliens of some sort. And then all the rest are really far out. No matter how people view it, they're not equal, because we don't know that you can time travel. We don't know that there's other dimensions, and we don't know, any of these other things. All we know is that life probably exists across the universe, but that life definitely exists here. So it's going to be, in my view, you have to favor one of those two. Either you go with the idea that they, for one reason or another, that this message is propaganda, that there is a civilization that is based in our solar system, that is from our solar system, and wants to hide that by telling you it's from an alien world, which I can understand them wanting to do, or that they genuinely are from an alien world. But I don't think that we are in any state to really come to an honest conclusion. I mean, I'd favor here that they are telling the truth and that they are from somewhere else. But yeah, I would never say to someone, and just take my word for it, because I think, we have to be wary that when you're dealing with another intelligence, they might have reasons to obscure parts of the story. In the same way we use counterintelligence and disinformation, to keep our assets safe, right? Maybe you don't want your true location broadcasted by us, So I think we do have to be wary. And with your work as well, and the other thing is that when we're looking at evidence for strange beings appearing, in places where we don't get, we say, a very clear line of ancestry locally or in the fossil record, is that if there is something here, whether from outer space or from here, that can manipulate on the level of what I'm kind of seeing in this evidence, which is basically like a Beethoven playing the piano level of messing with the code of life, right? Far beyond where humans are at now. Far beyond. I mean, I don't think anyone is talking about touching highly conserved regions in genetic evidence, editing today, because we don't understand these regions, and they're so fundamental to the functioning of an organism that any experiment we do will almost certainly kill that organism, right? So we're not near this. Like, I don't want to give any sense that, yes, we're editing animals, but this is someone who could create whatever they want. So if you look at something like the Tridactyls, or you look at, say, like the Star Child skull in Mexico, some of these anomalies that we've got from the past, which don't seem to have clear ancestry locally and just appear. Well, I mean, we have to consider that if someone knows how to play the code of life at this level, then they can create anything from a human fetus. That if they want to modify it and change your expression of your skull or the way you express your legs, or they want to splice in a retrovirus with information, or take some DNA from another species and splice it in, they can do it. I mean, just looking at what I'm seeing with this, if that's being done by an intelligence, then they know what they're doing in a way that we can barely comprehend. Like maybe they wrote the code, put it that way. It starts to look like someone who knows it so fundamentally that maybe they wrote that code, and that life here is seeded by them, and that DNA is biotechnology or something, and that they can just modify it as they please. We really don't know, but we can say that you'd have to have an extraordinary knowledge of it, and that, yes, certainly you could take a fetus and create a reptilian, a grey, a tridactyl. There's a point where once you know you're doing at that level, I don't see why they couldn't get the expression of those genes to do almost anything. And I'll put a last point as well before I put it back to you. So you may be aware of this, but there's some very strange things about humans as well. There's an expert on hybrids who points out that the human lineage has a large number of anomalies that are only found in pigs. And they're not in any of the other primates. Mm-hmm. They're not in any of our primate relatives, but are seen only in pigs. And he argues that we are some kind of pig hominin hybrid. And so, again, is that a natural hybrid, or is somebody modifying us even back then at the beginning of the hominin lineage?
I'm leaning towards the that big hypothesis also, but of course, a lot of what I do is based on cultural information. So I'm inferring from cultural information, taking the science and trying to find that middle ground where the two meet. And so even with the Tridactyls, I mentioned the 500 million year old morphology, but culturally speaking, there's people calling them fertility symbols, mother goddesses, creator beings. And it's between the cultural of them saying that and these 500 million year old past, plus obviously what you're saying tonight, it's just again and again and again pointing towards intervention. So I like to think that perhaps the, it was a combination of the creationists and the evolutionists were both right and wrong. I mean,
quite. And like, I think that we have to take it. I mean, I know it's difficult for people to take seriously something like the idea that, an intelligence could be modifying organisms on our planet, but even worse, that it could just, modify us. That's so much more personal and invasive. The idea, not just say that they created a kangaroo or something, but that they've had a role in changing us, and that they could take a human fetus and turn it into what looks like, a grey alien or a reptilian. I mean, obviously it has such an uncomfortable element that I can imagine people rejecting it just on the discomfort of the thought alone, let alone religious implications and the possibility it could be done again or is being done again somewhere. I can absolutely understand why people reject it, but I would say they should look at some of these other issues with the hybrid origins of our species, for example. That there are some very strange elements to this human story, not just 788,000 years ago, but that right from the beginning, the split from chimps. There's some really strange stuff, and I would say more recently, we get to kind of 200,000 years ago. Again, there's anomalies that occur with all the major kind of splits. I mean, last one, I'm very quickly. Again, you probably noticed, but there is a study a couple of years back saying that when we first develop, when we have the behavioral cognitive revolution, so say somewhere about 70,000 years ago or so, that when we first develop complex articulated language, that there's changes in the brain, in the frontal lobes, and in some of the genetics underlying that. And they said, but the thing that makes this really strange is that to be able to speak and to also have the kind of they're able to think in time and space. I'm going to meet you tonight, and we're going to do fish, and all of this abstract thinking. That we need this change in the brain. But the other thing is you need to be exposed to this kind of thinking and language in the first few years of your life. Otherwise, the areas of your brain that do this don't develop properly. It said, no, it said there's a hard problem here. Because it said it means that the first person that had this couldn't have been exposed to that because nobody else could speak. Nobody else had that thinking. So, right, so you get this hard problem.
Someone who could.
Yeah, it's like, who's there teaching them? There's this problem. Who's there teaching them?
Yeah, that's great. And I was just thinking again, culturally, the tutory gods coming down and teaching civilization, teaching language, teaching agriculture, etc., etc. So
exactly, and so it's there in the data.
Once again, yeah.
I know it's very far out for people, but it is there in the data. That's what I mean. So we can't say it's absolutely that.
And then even recently, I think you and I were both sharing the information about some of the ape genome, about the orangutans having what appears to be, I mean, perhaps you could translate it better than I could, but to me it seemed like they were alluding to the orangutan being some sort of I called it a seed bank of genetic information that had been coded and manipulated over time. Do you have anything on that?
Well, it looks like, I mean, I don't know if anyone saw this, but very recently they did, because there's been some studies in the past where they suggested orangutans, maybe we were closer to orangutans than chimps, even though it doesn't seem to square up fully with the, the genomic differences, although there's been some changes very recently as to how closely we are related to chimps. But one of the things they noticed is that they did a full genome of chimps, orangutans, and a couple of things. They'd never done the full genomes before, right? So just in the last few months, they did a check. And as one of the guys pointed out, there was to do, I think, the telomeres or something, that we are quite actually closer to the orangutans in reference to the telomere data that they were seeing than we were to the chimps. And so there's some really sort of funny little inconsistencies in the narrative that we are just, let's say, just closer to chimps. That either there's some splicing or something from both chimps and orangutans, or there's something else we're not understanding here in our relationship with orangutans and chimps. Because there's areas where we are closer to orangutans than chimps. And if we're saying orangutans are down in Southeast Asia and chimps are in Africa, no matter where you put us, this should be a problem, because we shouldn't be appearing in both places at once.
Well, that's why also I think of Southeast Asia as some sort of laboratory, this island area, and that these orangutans make a nice little seed bank. They're inclined to be alone, so if there's ever anything cataclysmic, they'll be spread out, and they won't. Each one of them will have a genetic. Again, genetic bank to refer to. That's what it looks like to me.
Well, yeah, like I said.
And again, going back and forth culturally, to me, I know you say they're coming from Australia, but it looks like also to me that there was some movement from Africa to Tibet, and Tibet back to Africa. And so there's definitely what appears from my cursory view a moving around of primates from here to there.
Well, yeah, the other thing is, this is, I'd say for much of the time, once we get past the, really very early hominins, so basically once we get to maybe 3 million years ago or so, that I think a lot of these species are distributed, and then we get movements both into and out of continent. One of the things we've been told, this idea, it's almost like there's a uni-flow. I think it's very rare to get a unidirectional flow from anywhere, right? So beings would move out of Africa, go back into Africa. Beings, if they're in Asia, some would go back to mainland. So I don't think there's ever been a time, I think if we're really honest about it, where it would make sense beyond when there's a catastrophe, right? Or extraordinary climate shift, where in those events, you'd imagine most of the traffic is one way. But for most of the time, there's no particular reason why, interbreeding isn't across regions and why groups don't move around. So I don't think we can ever totally limit it. All we can say is the majority of the gene flow generally is going in one direction, but there's always going to be a minority going the other way, just as migration. Most people might move out. Some people decide to stay. These kind of ideas, So I think we have to be very careful, because I think the public has been kind of sold a very simple picture that, people just came out of Africa, they did this there, they come back. I don't think that was ever true. I think that was never true. And if we look down in island Southeast Asia, like you said, the interesting thing about that is if you were doing experiments or whatever's going on there, there's a lot of different species, and if you're on different islands, reproductive, isolated, it is like a Lords of the Rings kind of really weird scenario where if there was someone organizing any of this, like you allude to, this is a kind of a perfect place to do that kind of experiments. Is you have, Hobbit people on Flores, and then they found these other Lusensians, Homo luisensis up in the Philippines, and then it turns out, you got Denisovan seems to be on, Papua, and you get to a point where you're like, well, that's weird. It's like there's so many species now of Homo that seem to be spread across those islands. And then in East Asia and China now, they're finding obviously the dragon people and a huge range of diverse fossils in East Asia. That whole region, the red deer people, they're super weird as well. There's a mass of these unexpected hominins across that region, which, yes, they could have evolved naturally, but if we are looking at
this is really speciation though, and just variation, I wonder, because every anthropologist wants to say, hey, I discovered a new Homo species.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
So I wonder sometimes it's just of all these.
I can test it. Yeah. Like I said to you earlier, I'm not a splitter. I'm definitely more of a lumper. But I think that if we're honest about it, I think Homo erectus. Well, I don't know if you know, but when they found the finds up in the Georgian Republic, with Dominici hominins, the variation between the 5 individuals was so great that they said if they'd found those fossils in separate places, they would have been calling them different species. But they're in one group together, living together in Dominici. So I think that we have been again misled with the idea of just how much variation. But look at humans today; we have huge variation morphologically.
I say that a lot. I stand next to some tall guy or something, and I'm like, we look like 2 different species.
It's the same today. So I think that, I think we probably are not talking about a huge range of people 2 million years ago. I think that most of the beings are probably Homo erectus or very close to Homo erectus, and that when we get this split with
Right.
like 790,000 years ago, I keep Neanderthals, Denisovans, us. I think we're all within, we could give them a catch-all name or a greater Homo sapien group,
Yeah,
whatever
maybe
you want to call it.
bigger group names. I think it'd be just even easier for my own brain to understand if we could, group them, and let's group them in bigger groups. All these different
I think
species,
so.
all these different species. It's kind of like.
Well, look, if you go with the genetics, again, this is my preference is genomics. It's like, what makes Homo sapiens Homo sapiens? Right? What makes humans humans? Because if we're saying that our large complex brain is what makes us Homo sapiens, well, Neanderthals and Denisovans had it too, and they can breed with us. So why are we really splitting them off?
What's so special about us, huh?
Right, what's so special? So we now know we weren't that special. So I don't think there's an argument. And like morphologically, yes, you can say Neanderthals had big brow ridges and a robust skull, but we also know these seem to be the traits of small grouped wild variants of a species versus larger, more tamed groups. And so we have the look of an animal that is being more domesticated, and the Neanderthals look like a feral version of us. So those morphological traits are deceptive in the same way that wolves and pet dogs, are not that far apart. But the way that
I think of dogs also, when you think of all these different, if you found the dog bones, you would think each dog was a different species, right?
Right. So some of these issues, it's very different morphology alone. I would say that we should look at the genomics, right? And if you look at the genomic data, I think you'd have to keep Denisovans and Neanderthals lumped in with us, that we all split away from the Homo erectus, and that we all had the large brains, we all had the chromosome 2 fusion, the HAR changes, all of the things that fundamentally make us who we are today. They have them too, and we had children with them, and we carry their DNA. So, like, at what point do we say maybe we're all part of one species, right?
Right. So, the other thing too, you said domestication. Part of that whole ape study that came out recently was this hypothesis that the bonobos were self-domesticated. And I just thought the term was it was insulting. It was insulting to my intelligence, this self-domestication. And it just alludes to me then, well, if that's the case, then maybe that too is evidence of some sort of taming of the beast within our genome.
Exactly. I mean, that's another thing is that, how did we end up in this process of domestication? So even if you go with this argument, they're trying to say is that modern humans in some way self-domesticated. Well, maybe we continued it, but how did that begin? How does that process begin? Because was that being exposed to another civilization, another culture?
Archaeological oxymorons, in my opinion, self-domestication. I'm even at the stage now where I don't even think dogs and cats were self-domesticated, as they say.
No, I think that in a way, they have to push the idea that animals can self-domesticate, because if not, then you have to say that humans had exposure to someone else. So unless you can make the argument for somewhere in nature, a creature that is self-domesticated
too, so it's all good,
right? We can self-domesticate.
Nobody's intervening.
They did it. Right, because otherwise, who domesticated us? It becomes that obvious question then. Well, who began the process of our self-domestication? How did that ever start to come about? Yeah. So that's another problem. Again, when you combine
why we are born feeble? Also, we are born feeble compared to other.
Right. Functionally, we are a fetus.
And I also considered. I mean, there's a nefarious thought to it. The nefarious thought is, I'm thinking of something like veal or suckling pig. I'm thinking of something nefarious like that. Or it could be something I suggested, perhaps an evidence of neotenic youthful traits that just are extended. So we're just in this extended period of youth, and maybe it's not such a bad thing. One more thing on the apes was that the gorillas, I believe they said, also had some sort of strange hominid ancestor in their background. And I think we also know that there's been cross-contamination of disease from gorillas to Homo sapiens. So to confuse the audience, I don't know.
Well, I mean, here's one that is worth pointing out as well, is that a lot of people have the assumption that when we talk about the ancestor, the shared ancestor of chimpanzees and humans, that, they have in their mind essentially a chimp, right? That we've all come from the chimps. But it's admitted in the literature that basically we don't know if instead there was a more human-like ancestor that we and the chimpanzees have come from. They said, no, nobody knows that. They said that is not something that anyone has any clue about. It may have been that was a more human-like ancestor, and chimps have become more ape-like because of them evolving into their niche, and that we might have both shared a human-like ancestor. So, like, some of these people just have in their heads, because it's not said to them ever, it's never even put as a thinking point, is that we really don't know that this was some ape-like creature. We don't know it wasn't a human-like creature. Right, so there's some really big question marks over who were these, these ancestors that are missing in the fossil record. And again, when they're missing in the fossil record, again, we don't know if it wasn't just in a lab and there is no body, because that's the other big question mark, is when you've got a missing link, when you can say, well, okay, did it ever exist, or are we just talking about there's a room and they churn out a new creature so that you don't find any fossils because there wasn't an intermediary species,
right?
They just so these are big question marks where nobody can establish that, and we haven't found some fossil that really says here's the ancestor. So there's some super big mysteries around our early origin, as well as the arrival of kind of Homo sapiens and large brain. I think that whole story, that 7 million years, is packed full of mystery as to how we come about, who was that original ancestor, what happens at 780,000 years ago. And again, as we touched on more recently, there's several periods, like, the behavioral revolution, cognitive revolution, like how do we get language if it has to be something we're exposed to? How does domestication start? Who starts that? When you start putting these all together, and then you say, oh, should we consider the possibility that either an ancient, crypto-terrestrial civilization was here, or an alien civilization? I think that it's screaming out for you to at least consider it, because there's so many converging lines of evidence that indicate those things, that it's scientifically, I think it's like a broken kind of to be able to try to say no, because these sound silly. They sound silly. They sound like science fiction. So let's not go there, even though there's multiple lines of evidence that would indicate you should be considering that.
I say with the Tridactyls that they've given us permission to think outside the box and relook at the current narrative once again with confidence, and not with the shame of a conspiracy theorist, when it's really just people trying to find answers like anyone else. And obviously there are bad actors out there. There seem to be, there's storytellers out there in the world. Go to your local pub and people will be whipping up some narrative that never happened. So that does happen. But again, I think the Tridactyls give us permission to rethink things, and we don't have to keep accepting the same narrative. And I have people trying to interpret artifacts with the same mindset of before the Tridactyls. There's that I call it Occam's spork, where someone comes up with the most simplest explanation for something despite the evidence. And one of the most famous ones with the Tridactyls is, well, they drew 3 fingers because 5 was too hard. Weird things like that people come up with, and they're still making those same quotes, and I don't think we have to do that.
No. What I'm really excited about there is I know that there's more genomic data is going to be coming. I understand there's been some new sampling done, potentially with new bodies. So, obviously I'd really like to see as many new sets of full genome, or as near to full genome as you can get with the ancient DNA, but as much genetic data as possible from as many of the bodies as possible, because I think that, certainly from my perspective, that the most interesting story is most likely to be told in there. Again, because you can't really say, like, someone's if you say someone's messed with the genetic data, well, then you're also saying that someone with advanced science, so you can say someone's messed with a body if you want, but very hard to say that. Well, how do you say, there's something turns out to be in that genome that shouldn't be there, and it is there, that I think that's going to be
someone
really,
messed with the
really
DNA.
Right, yeah, it's like, how do you do that? Because if you get a sample, say, inside a tooth, like what do you say to that? You can't say, if you take material inside of a tooth and it comes back that this is not a normal human, you can't say someone's put some other bit of a tooth inside the tooth. I mean, there's an end point where at some point you can't keep coming up with excuses. You have to say, well, that's what the data is saying. So yeah, I'm quite keen to see what else they bring forward with the genetic data, but I don't know how good the quality will be from recovery, because of course it all comes down to, did DNA survive? Otherwise, what quality of DNA survived? How much contamination? How much, is other fungi, all the rest, what do they end up with in the different sample sets? But yeah, if we get anything like, full genomes and stuff, then it's going to be really hard for anyone to turn and say, well, that's made up, So I'm really hoping that happens. From my understanding, from your understanding, as far as I know, that there's in process some new ones. So I've been told.
I think the two original ones, possibly, that were originally shown to the Congress, have been in a separate lab on the down low, so not as another team, if you will, which is always good, right?
Yeah.
So the bad news is those bodies are being spirited all over the globe.
Right.
The good news is different groups of scientists are getting their hands on them.
I think one of the biggest issues, isn't it, is
yeah, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I think one of the biggest concerns, and obviously handicaps, I'm sure you feel this, is the involvement of bad actors, and also therefore not being able to get to the site, the discovery site, and not be able to analyze, the layers where they're found in, look for things like DNA in the soil, like all these other things that could be done. That it's so unfortunate this wasn't found in a setting where, it wasn't bad actors involved, and it was just regular people, and they just turned it all over to a university.
Yeah,
so it's handicapped
criminality.
Right.
Criminality is literally involved, and
yes,
and you bring that up, and I would like to put a good word out for Theory, running the alienproject.com. He is one of the early points of contact, and he has made it evident that he is very concerned about Peru's native resources, and he's very concerned about the science and whatnot. I know there gets to be that sort of this circus around it, but obviously people inserted themselves into the narrative as well, and kind of increase the sort of sensationalism. Of course, I say that, but Theory did name his site The Alien Project, right?
But my impression, I talked to him like very early on in 2015 or something, and I communicated with him when this was first kind of coming out. Because my wife and I are sort of Spanish speakers, and she's fluent Spanish, and we were living in Ecuador at the time. We sort of read about what was happening there, and so I actually did try to kind of broker some media links for Fieri with some people in the US. But in the end, he did some work with Gaia, and I know that didn't really go well. So it's a shame that he didn't kind of go the direction I tried to help him with, because he ended up with the circus with Gaia and all these problems, which I think they could have avoided, to be honest. So, I was quite sort of, like, I have to say, I was quite impressed with how he was with things and what they were seeing, so I've kept an open mind the whole time about where it's going, because I know that, from my perspective, there's a lot of well-meaning people and unfortunately some bad actors. And that's been how it's been the whole time. And it's just, it's a shame that it's got that involvement to it, because of course that's handicapped the kind of additional research we would love to see, which is someone going into the discovery site, exploring the layers that are there, looking, for other dating artifacts, DNA in the soil, all sorts of other stuff could be done, but we're just, it's being handicapped by that involvement of control around the discovery sites, and obviously money making, which is also, of course, has encouraged people to then create fakes from what they've seen, so that we know that there's other stuff that's gone on. People because there's money. People are seeing a way to make money, and so they say, if you can sell some of these, then I'm going to make one that looks like it. So then it's making it. So we've ended up with this kind of a circus, which is, is such a shame. But the thing is, people have to remember is we have objective evidence in this case that people can look at and consider. You're not saying trust me. We're not saying just believe me because I think it's that. You say, look at the scans, look at the genetic data that's there, consider the cultural additional evidence from, like I say, the Tridactyl art, the other things that and consider that there is a case to be investigated here. It's not something that we just have to do, Ripley's believe it or not, that, you can come to a conclusion. And look, if someone concludes that they don't believe it after considering the evidence, that's okay. No one's expecting 100% of people to be convinced on anything. Just as I don't expect it with what I'm doing. I'd be super surprised to get a consensus around, especially very quickly, around an extraordinary set of claims, right? That, next week everyone agrees aliens modified us. I don't think we'd ever agree to that. Even if it was shown to be, let's say, 99% solid, a good portion of the world would never accept that kind of position, and I understand it for ideological reasons and all sorts of other reasons. They would never accept it. I mean, people can't even accept the shape of the planet. We've still got people who say that we're on a flat, so I don't think we should say we'll ever get a consensus, but I do believe we can move to a position where a large section of the global community is convinced that there is evidence of past advanced technologies being used for genetic engineering, both fairly recently and in the very distant past. And I think that that is a position I think that we are going to gradually move towards with some of these cases. And, eventually over the coming centuries, maybe the whole world will catch up. But initially, I think it'd be trailblazers and open-minded critical thinkers that are willing to look at these cases and start to get to the conclusion that, yeah, maybe we need to rethink a chunk of the human story.
Yeah, agreed. Let's wrap it up with if you could give some advice or direct people into investigating what you cover, and then also we could just go back and just throw in there any advice to people who are screaming into the void.
Sure. I mean, on that point, they're very quick to say, in many ways, I am very fortunate. So I don't want to say that, it's all like that, because, of course, I have got some media presence. I have been covered in mainstream news for other things I've done. I've been in British press for going into the Ecuadorian Amazon and helping to investigate a strange site there in the past. I've done, Ancient Aliens and the Unexplained Files, as well as having, quite a following online. So, I mean, I don't want to be too skewed, because I say all that because I know there's people in far worse positions trying to get very good quality data out there on cases that are very maligned and have been very kind of suppressed and ignored. So, I mean, I'd say actually I'm quite fortunate to have got to a point where, my work is considered by quite a lot of people, even if I do sometimes complain that, I don't think that it's getting the attention it should get. But yeah, I do recommend that people, especially recommendation-wise, I think that one of the things people shouldn't be scared of is to read scientific literature, to read studies, to read articles in journals, and to if you have a passion for a topic, or if you're very interested in something like the work that I'm doing or the work that you do, that get used to reading the papers in those fields. And you don't have to read every single word. I mean, I would say the first thing is find go through the abstracts and the conclusions on a paper. So if there's an area that you're interested in, like with the HARs I've talked about, you don't have to go and read the entire papers, but you can get a very good idea that that there's a real phenomenon here and what it's about by going in, looking up, say, human accelerated regions, look at the abstract on a paper. You'll get a sense from an abstract whether you think it's worth reading. Check the conclusion. Is it very exciting? And you'll know whether you want to read a whole paper. But do become familiar with it, because it helps with critical thinking. It helps to understand the scientific process. Also, it helps to sound more informed when you have a discussion on a topic that you can refer back to literature in the field, rather than just saying that I believe that. There's a lot of I believes, and do you believe me in the UFO and aliens kind of topics? There's a lot of reliance on he seems believable, or he seems like a nice person. I don't want anyone to agree with me because they think I'm a nice person, or because I seem believable, right? Because I think that's a very, very airy-fairy position, saying so critically, fundamentally changing about who we are, that they should be very certain that what I'm saying is grounded in reality. And that goes for any of these kind of extraordinary topics. If someone's trying to sell you the idea that people came from Mars, or that there was a global war, or nuclear war, go to the literature and look to see if the things they're saying have any tangible support in scientific investigations of the past. Otherwise, don't just go on your emotional feelings, because as humans, we are emotionally connected to stories, we emotionally connect to people, and we will tend to want to believe those narratives, and often they are baseless. So, and I said, is equally for myself and yourself, that people should be very wary of that don't go on that, because that's how you get pulled into the whole UFO circus of waiting for disclosures and believing in heroes, and it goes round and round forever. Educate yourself on the literature and the topic you're interested in. Become as convergent as you can, without becoming a PhD, but become conversant in the literature that underlies the things that are claimed. And so for my work, if they're interested in what I'm doing, I suggest read my kind of preprint paper on ResearchGate on Technosignatures alien Technosignature paper, where I make a case for the fact that the Australasian tektite is from a destroyed structure in space, and they can see kind of how I make that argument. It may not come away agreeing with it, but you can see that I've made that argument from the literature on tectile analysis and interstellar objects, and that that I think that is the way that we kind of have to do things in these areas. It's a combination of using a kind of both the mainstream approach, is knowing the literature and arguing from the literature, but also using the new media that we have and social media and connecting with people and telling the story. But I do think it should be a mixture of both, not just dry academia or just I've got an amazing story and I'm going to be on YouTube. That I think that for these kind of cases, it needs a bit of both. So I do recommend people look at both the story and the evidence underlying the story, and be quite critical around it. And I'm quite happy to answer questions to people or point them to literature, but I don't want anyone to say just believe it because Bruce is a nice guy, or I don't like it because I don't like him, and all that kind of stuff. It's not the way to consider something so profound as the possible involvement of aliens in our reality.
Right.
It's not why I'm convinced of it. Put it this way: it wasn't just because it was a great story. It took me a lot to really come to that point of saying there's enough here for me to think this is real, and enough to put my kind of life on hold a bit dealing with this when I could be doing other things. And I've spent 7 years or so on this now. Do you know what I mean?
Oh, wow.
Right. So it had to be quite convincing, because I could have just carried on doing other things. My
Sure.
previous book was doing well. Graham Hancock wrote the foreword to my Forgotten Exodus. He boosted my book in social media. I was going to write a second book, a follow-on to that, which would have made a lot of sense, because I would have just flowed on with that. But I weighed it up and thought, but if this other thing is true, the implications are so profound that could I kind of live with myself looking back saying, but I chose to ignore it because it would be hard to deal with. So I know, I do recommend people have a look at it. Have a look, look at the paper, go on my work. They can go on my Substack, a couple of short documentaries and presentations on my Twitter profile. So if anyone goes on my pin post and look at the comments under the pin post, there's some videos and stuff there. Again, they can ask me though. I'm pretty approachable, as on Twitter. If anyone wants to kind of, query with me about it, I'm happy to respond there.
Well, excellent. Thank you so much for coming on. Again, I started this by saying I hope that we can intermingle our theories, and hopefully I can get answers from you. That would be great in some of this.
I'd love an anthropological perspective on some of the stuff we're doing. So I think crossover stuff and trying to assist each other where we can is a great idea.
Awesome. Again, thank you so much for coming. Thanks everyone who watched and listened, and live long and prosper, my man. I'll see you on Twitter. Okay. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.